All right. In recent years, there's a new term or word that has worked its way into our language. And the word is influencer or social media influencer. As I'm sure that you're aware, a social media influencer is someone who has somehow become famous for being famous. And this is done because they've built this large following online, usually on Instagram or TikTok or one of the other social media platforms. And now they have the ability to influence certain people to buy certain products or listen to certain artists or attend certain events or even think in a certain way. Celebrity influencers are nothing new. A great deal of advertising is built on the idea that you will drink this soda if a particular movie star also drinks this soda. Or you'll vote for this candidate or hold this political opinion if a certain celebrity says that you should. Now, I don't know if this is such a good idea, which is actually a nice way of me saying that it's a terrible idea, because you don't want to make choices in life and draw conclusions based on what a famous person thinks. You should want to be selective in who you allow to influence your thoughts, ideas, and behavior. You want to be intentional in how you choose those who will influence you and those whose example you're going to follow. Obviously, for us as Christians, the key influencer in our lives should be Jesus. What he said and what he did should be the guiding light behind all of our decisions. That's why he said in John 13:15, "For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done for you." Now clearly, Jesus needs to be front and center in our circle of influence. But there are others whose example we can follow as well. In his letter to the church in Corinth, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11:1, "Imitate me as I also imitate Christ." So these are the questions that we need to ask as we look for examples of who to follow. Does this person demonstrate the qualities and characteristics of Jesus Christ? Do I see the presence of God in this person's attitude and actions? These are the types of people that you want to choose as influencers and role models, even to the point of imitation. Even as old as many of us are, we can even find mentors that follow those same standards. Now, I'm talking about people who have the wisdom that we may need that can speak into our lives and give us the guidance that we need on matters of importance. In order for us to be rightly connected to others in a way that supports our spiritual growth, we need to ask ourselves, who are my influences? Who do I listen to the most? Whose opinion do I value? Whose example do I seek to follow? And I think all of us would probably admit that what we need to do is follow the best example. We should seek to follow those whose lives reflect what it is that we see in Christ. In the final paragraphs of the book of 1 Corinthians, after discussing all of these problems and challenges that the church had been up against, Paul begins to get personal. And he calls out a few leaders for very special recognition. And he notes how their example is worth following. And he says in verse 18 in chapter 16 that such leaders deserve recognition. So tonight, as we conclude this series on 1 Corinthians, we're going to take a closer look at these early church influencers. These individuals who, by their example, showed the believers in the church of Corinth how to put the right attitude and the right priorities into action. So let's look at these leaders and reflect a little bit on what Paul said about each and every one of them, and consider how we can maybe follow their example. We're all leaders in some area of our lives. We're all influencers on some level, even if we don't have a TikTok account. So as we look at this final section in chapter 16, let's take a note of these three examples that we would do well to follow. Each one of these examples center around the idea of a leader being not a celebrity, but a servant. The first example Paul draws to our attention, is not from a member of the Corinthian church, but it's from a colleague that he had worked with from time to time. His name was Apollos, and he had a connection to the church there. And here's the lesson that we can learn from him. We need to know when to defer. Another way to say this would be know when to stay out of it. We've talked about the backstory a little bit in the past of what was going on in the Corinthian church. And the church in Corinth had quite a bit of division. Different groups had attached themselves to different leaders. Some were of Apollos, some were of Cephas, some were of Paul, and some, I suppose those who felt that they were the most elitist in the church, claimed to be of Christ. And in the early chapters, Paul calls all of them out, and not in a good way. And he tells them that the nonsense that's going on needs to stop. So, who was Apollos? Well, he was a Jewish believer from Alexandria, which was a highly educated place. And he was highly educated. He was a very eloquent speaker. He was referred to in the book of Acts, in Acts 18:24, as mighty in scriptures. Now, early in this letter, Paul referenced how he himself had planted in Corinth and how Apollos had watered the plant. So we see that Apollos played a very important role in the growth of the church in Corinth. And his working with Paul, they didn't see themselves at all as competitors because they worked together. However, there were those in the church in Corinth who considered them competitors, even though they weren't. And Paul wanted this problem resolved once and for all. So he asked Apollos to visit the church. And Apollos said, in effect, thanks, but no thanks. Look in chapter 16, 1 Corinthians 16, verse 12. Paul says, about our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to come to you with the brothers, but he was not at all willing to come now. However, he will come when he has an opportunity. Now, these phrases, strongly urged and not at all willing, I don't think fully convey the weight of this statement. From what I can tell, as I studied this a little bit, and as I understand it, it would be more like I begged him to go, and he flat out refused. Apollos declined, most likely out of respect for Paul. as if he were saying, you know what? You have a much closer relationship to the people in this church than I do. If there's a matter that needs to be resolved, I'm going to stay out of your way and I'm going to let you take care of it. Now, maybe he realized that his presence there would simply make matters more awkward, not less awkward. In Acts 18, Luke tells us that Apollos had preached boldly in the synagogue and he taught about Jesus, but he knew only about the baptism of John at that time. Priscilla and Aquila, whom we're going to look at here in just a couple of points, heard him preach and invited him into their home, and in Acts 18:26 says, explained the way of God even more accurately to him. And what did Apollos do? Well, he listened and he learned. He was a leader, but he was also teachable. He was a leader, but he wasn't a know-it-all. As much as he knew he didn't know it all. He didn't have to make everything about himself. He knew when to defer. So what's the lesson for us today? There are times when we ourselves simply need to stay out of it. There are times when conflict arises between our friends or family members or even in the church, and it's tempting to get in the middle of it. But maybe it's best in that particular case to keep your distance and let those involved resolve it on their own. There are times in the church, there are times when I was at work, in a work environment, when someone was put in charge of a specific project. And I knew that my way was better. But I wasn't the one that was put in charge. And so my responsibility was to defer to them. A leader can't be a servant if the leader has to be in charge of everything all the time. A phrase that we often hear today is, stay in your own lane. That's what Apollos did. And it's what we all need to do. Let's follow his lead. So here's the second example of a servant leadership that we can learn to follow. This is from a man named Stephanas. He and his household were among the first Christian converts in Achaia, and he had been baptized personally by the Apostle Paul. So how is it that we can imitate Stephanas? We can seek to refresh others. Look at 1 Corinthians 16, verses 17 and 18. I am pleased to have Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus, and I know I'm pronouncing every one of those wrong, okay? But I'm fortunate to have them present because these men have made up for your absence, for they have refreshed my spirit and yours. Therefore, recognize such people. These three individuals had come to Ephesus, where Paul was working when he wrote this letter. And he had mentioned earlier in this chapter, as we saw last week, that he had a great opportunity for ministry where he was. And he also was facing great opposition. So the arrival of Stephanas and the others lifted his spirit. Paul also said about Stephanas and his associates. Look in verse 15. He says, you know that Stephanas and his household were the first of the harvest of believers in Greece. And they are spending their lives in service to God's people. What a great compliment. And what a worthwhile goal to be in service to God's people to refresh others. I read a quote that said, "A word of encouragement during a failure is worth more than an hour of praise after success." We sometimes forget just how much other people need an encouraging word, how much they need their spirit to be refreshed. Dr. Jerome Motto, a psychiatrist in California, told a particularly haunting story about a man who ended his life one day on the Golden Gate Bridge. This man was in his 30s and he lived alone. He felt alienated from everyone. So one afternoon, he wrote a note and he left it on his bureau. And the note said, "I'm going to walk to the bridge. If one person smiles at me on the way, I won't jump." The people we encounter every day, day in and day out, may not be in such dire straits as this guy. But maybe they are. But you can be sure that those that we encounter each and every day all have one thing in common. Every person you encounter needs encouragement. Chick-fil-A founder Truett Cathy once said, "How do you recognize a person who needs encouragement? Well, that's easy. That person is breathing." In other words, everyone needs encouragement. What if you were to make it your objective to be the breath of fresh air that others so desperately need? What if you set out to uplift those around you as they face the challenges of daily life? Who knows what could happen? People still might be reading about you in 1,000 years. A leader is devoted to the service of others. And one way we serve is to encourage one another, to invigorate those who've lost their vig. Okay, yeah, that sounded a lot cuter when I wrote it than it did. Then it came across, obviously. Okay, to refresh those who need help along the way. And then here's the third example of servant leadership that we can learn to follow. And this one comes from a Jewish couple named Priscilla and Aquila. I mentioned them a little earlier. They were tent makers, just like Paul was. And they were able to work on the move. And here's the example that they gave for us to follow. Do good wherever you go. Priscilla and Aquila were originally from Rome. And in about 49 AD, the Emperor Claudius banished all Jews from the city. And so the couple were forced to move to a new location. They chose Corinth. And that's where they met the Apostle Paul. They served in Corinth. And from there, they went to Ephesus, again, working with Paul. And later, then they were able to actually return to Rome. Wherever they went, they were engaged in ministry. Wherever they went, they served God's people. Now, I mentioned before the role that they played in mentoring Apollos. They saw his potential and they invested their lives into his future. They also had a habit of opening their home as a gathering place for God's people. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 16:19, "The churches of Asia greet you. Aquila and Priscilla greet you warmly in the Lord, along with the church that meets in their home." Later in Paul's ministry, when he wrote his letter to the church of Rome, he said this in Romans 16, verses 3 through 5. He said, give my greetings to Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their own necks for my life. Not only do I thank them, but so do all the Gentile churches. Greet also the church that meets in their home. Wherever they went, they sought to partner with other leaders in ministry and to serve the church of Jesus Christ. Many times even having a church in their home. I've known Christian people who moved to a new town or city and they began looking for a church. And once they found the church that they felt God was leading them to, they got involved. They didn't feel like their responsibility was just to sit out there and sing the songs that the whole congregation sings and then just to listen to whatever it was that the preacher said. They felt God had led them to the church for a specific reason, and they wanted to fulfill God's purpose for their lives. So they found a place to serve in the church. They rolled up their sleeves and they got to it. They did this because they couldn't not help. It's just who they were. And that attitude reminds me of something that John Wesley once said. He said, do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. That's an example. That's the kind of example that Priscilla and Aquila gave us to follow. So the question we need to ask ourselves is not, what's most convenient for me? The question should be, where can I do the most good? How can I lend a hand? Whether it's in Rome or Greece or rural Texas, servant leaders look for the opportunity to do good. For most of his career, Albert Einstein kept the portraits of two scientists on the wall above his desk, Isaac Newton and James Clerk Maxwell. Then toward the end of his life, he replaced those portraits with Mahatma Gandhi and Albert Schweitzer. And he said, it's time to replace the image of success with the image of service. As you all probably know, Albert Schweitzer had spent decades serving as a medical missionary in Central Africa. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952. Albert Einstein had been inspired by these words spoken earlier by Dr. Schweitzer. He said, I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I know, the only ones among you who will be truly happy are those who have sought and found how to serve. There are a lot of people today who wear the label influencer. They're known for marketing their opinions. But what can an opinion accomplish? Paulo Coelho, a Brazilian author, said this: the world is changed by your example, not your opinion. That's what a leader looks like. And this is how leaders make a difference. They serve. And it's how we make a difference as well. We look for ways to serve. We do what we can to make each situation better than it was before we got there. Paul gave recognition to the leaders, and he said that we should submit to such people and to everyone who works and labors with them. It's not a bad idea. So let's be influenced by those who give us the best example to follow. And let's look for ways that we can use our area of leadership to serve other people. Take out your prayer sheets.